As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So the Israeli military announced on Sunday that it was withdrawing troops from parts of southern Gaza, and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said that this step was being taken to prepare for an assault on Rafah, which is the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip that borders Egypt and is packed with over 1 million Palestinians. So Gallant said, quote, "The withdrawal of the troops from Khan Yunis was carried out after Hamas ceased to function as a military organization in the city. The forces left to prepare for the operation in Rafah," end quote. So Lieutenant General Herzi Halevi, who's the head of the Israeli military, he said the withdrawal does not mean the Israeli slaughter of Palestinians would come to an end anytime soon. He said, quote, "The war in Gaza continues and we are far from stopping. Senior Hamas officials are still in hiding. We will get to them sooner or later," end quote. So if you remember earlier, a few months back, you had Israel withdraw troops from northern Gaza, but they continued to bomb the areas there, and then they ended up launching another siege on the Al-Shifa hospital, which is in northern Gaza. So one thing that this could do is move. It could end up that some of the Palestinians sheltering in Rafah could go to Khan Yunis if that's where they're from. Although we have another story that I'll get to later about how Khan Yunis is just completely destroyed, and the Palestinians returning there are just finding rubble, and there's just nothing for them left there, so it doesn't look like it's a place for them to live. Former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi joined a group of House Democrats in a letter urging President Biden to halt weapons transfers to Israel until there's a full investigation into the Israeli killing of 7 workers for the World Central Kitchen. So Pelosi's signature is notable because she has been a staunch supporter of Israel throughout her long career in Congress. I mean, this is very surprising for me to see. Of course, I don't think she's had a change of heart. I'm sure it's about elections coming up and all that. But one quote that I put in from Pelosi, this is from 2018, just to show how much she loves Israel. She said a few years ago, quote, "If this capital crumbled to the ground, the one thing that would remain is our commitment, our aid, our cooperation with Israel," end quote. So if the capital crumbled to the ground, if Washington, D.C. crumbled to the ground, Pelosi says the one thing that would remain is military aid to Israel. So her signature, another angle, it does seem like the Democratic establishment wants to go after Netanyahu. So maybe this could be part of that strategy. We saw Chuck Schumer calling for early elections. But either way, still, I think it's pathetic for other Democrats that haven't, signed on to this letter. The fact that Pelosi did it before them is really shameful. So this letter was signed by a total of 40 House Democrats, and it called for the U.S. to halt arms shipments to Israel until a full investigation into the killing of these workers is completed. So the letter reads, quote, "In light of this incident, we strongly urge you to reconsider your recent decision to authorize the transfer of a new arms package to Israel and to withhold this and any future offensive arms transfers until a full investigation into the airstrike is complete. If this strike is found to have been violated, if this strike is found to have violated U.S. or international law, we urge you to continue withholding these transfers until those responsible are held accountable. We also urge you to withhold these transfers if Israel fails to sufficiently mitigate harm to innocent civilians in Gaza, including aid workers, and if it fails to facilitate the transport and delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza," end quote. So I just mentioned in the article, the killing of the World Central Kitchen workers has gotten all this attention, and, it should have, because it was a horrific crime. But Israel has been doing this throughout these 6 months. Israel has killed over 220 aid workers in Gaza, and that includes 177 employees of the UN's Palestinian Relief Agency. But those are Palestinians, and American politicians don't care when Palestinians are killed. That's just the reality. It's very unfortunate for the Palestinians. But this, they killed a few foreigners, including an American citizen. So I think that's why we're seeing the response that we're seeing. It says Ukraine conducted a large-scale drone swarm attack on a military base inside Russia, but Moscow's air defense appears to have downed the UAVs. As Ukrainian forces continue to lose territory across a vast front line, Kiev has increasingly resorted to attacks on Russian soil. So this was on Friday, and Ukraine launched about 50 drones at an airbase in southern Russia. The Ukrainian side claimed that they hit their mark and damaged or destroyed 14 aircraft, but that Russia denied the losses and said that air defenses repelled and downed most of the drones. And satellite imagery kind of reflects that from before and after the operation. It shows no sign of damage to the aircraft or to the base, suggesting that Russia was able to shoot down most of the incoming drones. But we're seeing more and more, Ukraine continues to launch these attacks inside Russia. And there's been reports that say the drone attacks use intelligence provided by Western countries. So Russia views these as NATO-supported attacks, so they could always lead to a big escalation.
If you want to understand the principles of the revolution, when we talk about the revolution, we're not talking about the war for independence. That was an outgrowth. The revolution was from around 1760, 1761 through 1775, when the shot heard round the world, Lexington and Concord. It was the radical change in the viewpoints of the people, a new understanding, a concept of sovereignty, of final authority, all power flows from the people, and the like. But if you want to understand how the vast majority of people understood things at the time, you got to read John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, written in response to the Townsend Acts in 1767, published in late 1767 and throughout 1768. These were the most widely read documents on American liberty throughout the Revolution, up until publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, when the fighting was already going in 1776. And here's an example that he gave that I've cited many times in his 9th letter, talking about how Spain was once free, as he put it. Their Cortes resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject without their consent, none. One of their kings, though, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed, and Dickinson put some highlights here, all caps and bold and italics. This isn't something that's new in email forwards today. Dickinson used this pretty regularly here, some caps, but here he highlighted that he might be allowed for that emergency only. And that was what he's really emphasizing. The people in Spain were sold on the idea that, well, it's a war, it's an emergency. I know there's a limit on whether or not we can raise money outside the rule, on how we raise the money in order so, well, you don't have one dude making the decision of how all the money's going to go. And that check on power was, well, the king asked, well, in this emergency only, can we raise more money without assembling the Cortes, the parliament? The request, Dickinson writes, was violently opposed by the best and wisest men in the assembly. It was, however, just like we see so many times today, opposition to mass warrantless surveillance, to the Patriot Act, and so many other things are just used for one emergency. And then over time, people learn, well, wait a second, I thought this was just going to be for this. How is it expanded to everything else? We see this in almost everything that government does. Those are just some big examples. And Dickinson points out that it was, however, complied with by the votes of a majority. And this single concession, one time during a war as an emergency to allow them to raise money without following the rules, he said, was a precedent. And he put all caps on precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. So it went from the king could only get money with approval of the representatives of the people. Then it went to, well, we just have one emergency. And then from each precedent, you build upon that. That's what government does. And eventually, it wasn't just in emergency situations. The king eventually ended up with a general power to raise money whenever the king decided it was necessary. Very similar to how, well, maybe they've twisted, I'm just thinking of this as I'm talking through it. Maybe it's similar to how government treats the necessary and proper clause. Even though there is a very specific legal doctrine, a doctrine of principles and incidents, it has ended up, as many of the anti-federalists warned, that government would determine what government decides what's necessary for government to do. And when you give government that power, you shouldn't be surprised when that government always grows, no matter who's there. So Dickinson warned that this one single concession, even in a time of war, was a precedent. And he said from that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful, and the people ceased to be free. And like he did at the end of this letter, number 9, he had a very important Latin phrase, well-read dude. I can't read it in Latin. He said, oppose a disease at its beginning. This is very similar to what James Otis Jr. had used, John Adams had used, another phrase called obsta principiis, which is nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud. This is what the founders and old revolutionaries really thought was incredibly important. Now, Dickinson took the same approach in response to the Stamp Act in 1765. And he was discussing the Stamp Act in 1767 still, because some people are saying, oh, this is just kind of a small thing. I'll get to that in a moment. This is the least offensive thing. Why should we stick our necks out? And he is pointing out that the Stamp Act was a precedent, and we opposed it because of the precedent at the time. And at the time, he published a broadside urging people to refuse to comply with it. Why? And in his words, he said, if you comply with the act, You rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. He pointed out you voluntarily do this too. So by complying with something that they're not authorized to do, even if you think it's a small thing that they're not supposed to do, you are establishing the chains that will bind you for all time. Now, unfortunately, most people don't take this attitude today, but he went a little further. He said, you voluntarily establish the detestable precedent, which those who have forged your fetters ardently wish for, to varnish the future exercise of this new claimed authority. Again, if you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. Voluntarily, you just give in and give them the power. Government's going to try to do stuff that they're not authorized to do. If we don't recognize that all governments do this, then we're being pretty dumb. This is a very dangerous approach. If we recognize that what governments do, which is grow and violate liberty and take your money and, well, counterfeit and all kinds of bad stuff, if we allow them to take a single step, why should we be surprised when they take another step? He said, power is of a tenacious nature. What it seizes, it will retain. And he was responding to the point that some people say, well, no huge deal. It's not a huge deal. It's okay because it's a small thing and we'll get it repealed later. And he's pointing out, no. Whatever government takes, they don't give up. And he put it this way. If you quietly bend your necks to that yoke, you prove yourselves ready to receive any bondage to which your lords and masters shall please to subject you.
A lack of solidarity within NATO. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is making several countries in Europe reassess their military defenses. Several members of NATO have said they'll be increasing their numbers of conscripted soldiers, the latest of which were Denmark and Norway. But what are the sentiments of people living in NATO states on the topic? And go to this chart because we love charts because they really graphically demonstrate. The blue, as you see in these charts, is those who believe that they should be defended by NATO. The countries who believe that NATO should and will come to their defense. Now the orange is them believing that they should defend the other members. And that is, in some countries, a huge gap. In the US, for example, 70% said, well, they got to come to our defense, where only 60% say, we got to come to everyone else's defense.
When I was thinking about this, I thought, I wonder how many people there really have been in the past that believe these countries are going to really come and help us out if we really needed them. We're there for a very specific reason. We're developing a market. The market is very important because we deal with it. We're a participant. We have something to say. We'll get control of NATO. And this encourages them because I don't believe, we go to help a lot of people, but it's always the market, what they have. And even if it were a legitimate battle going on and you decide, well, this is just too bad, we're going to join them and we're going to announce, but they don't fight to win, they fight to fight. And we know where all the money goes and how much goes, and yet right now the irony of it all is this has been so ingrained, they don't hesitate for a minute if they think that, we need $10 billion more for next year to help all these countries. And not enough people say, well, where are you going to get the money? Where's the money coming from? Well, they don't want to know. They really know, and they think they can fool people forever that we have a secret. It's called a printing press, and the other big secret is very few people have learned that the poor and the middle class will bear the burden because they're the ones. You don't see people who are making $200,000 or $300,000 a year or a lot more complaining about the price of bread. And so the people who have to pay are the the middle class and less because the price is going up and that is a tax and it goes up because nobody asks where's the money coming from. Well, we don't have it, so we'll print it. Can you get away with that for a while? Sometimes a long time if you have military backing up your currency. And that essentially is true. There is a backing of a currency with the military because nobody wants to mess around. Then you get control of the financial market, and we have these tools of discipline our friends, because if you want us to come and rescue you better do what we tell you.
Well, the political leaders, especially in Europe, with a couple of exceptions, let's say, they all want to say it's all for one and one for all. Article 5, we're going to all defend each other. But if you put that chart back up, it's clear they don't really think that way. Or certainly the people in those countries don't think that way. Now let's look just at Bulgaria, for example. 68% of respondents in Bulgaria believe that they should be protected if something happens to Bulgaria. But only 42% believe that Bulgaria should round up its men, and probably women, who knows, and send them off to fight and die for Ukraine, for example. It's a huge gap between 42 and 68. And it's elsewhere. Iceland, 78% said, well, you better come defend us if we run into some problems. But only 47%, less than half of the people in Iceland surveyed, believe that Iceland has any obligation to defend the other NATO members. That is just an incredible when you think about that. Look at what Trump actually said, because he's getting a lot of heat for it. But put up that next clip. Here's what Trump posted on his social media. My view is the states will determine by legislation or vote, or perhaps both, and whatever they decide must be the law of the land. In this case, the law of the state. Many states will be different. Many will have a different number of weeks, or some will have more conservative than others, and that's what they will be. At the end of the day, this is all about the will of the people, Trump said. You must follow your heart, or in many cases, your religion or your faith. Do what's right for your family and do what's right for yourself. Do what's right for our country. And this looks like a radical position unless you consider what you've always said, which is there are a lot of other crimes that are only state crimes, most of them.
Oh yeah, everything almost. I mean, just think of how many different types of killing it can go when you get into manslaughter, voluntary and involuntary, accidents happening, all these things. And the states haven't gone through. We have to universalize. We know these circumstances, and sometimes there's different penalties. And then, of course, I think it should be states that deal with acts of violence, and when necessary, you use a jury. It too will be imperfect, but I think that is what we were given with the Constitution, and I think the statement is reasonable, what he made.
Yeah, and this is one way the right is like the left. They want to federalize everything, but that doesn't work very well in your favor when you got a place like California, when you've got New York. If you have conservative Texas, and Texas has a rule that's way more conservative, why would you want to bend to the will of some crazies out on the West Coast?
You know what?